Hidizs makes a lot of gear, from IEMs to DAPs, cables, and portable DACs. They typically cater to the budget-oriented audiophile and tend to provide good value. HiFiGo asked if I wanted to try out one of Hidizs' new IEMs, and they sent me the MM2. This product costs under $80. Let's see what this budget IEM has to offer. The MM2 uses a dual dynamic driver with what Hidizs calls, quote, adjustable tuning through their interchangeable valve system. They claim that the MM2 will provide you with, quote, all new clarity and powerful lower-end, crisp mid-range, and takes the high-res experience a step ahead with resolution and clarity, end quote. Hidizs says that their design results in exceptional details in the high-frequency region and a lovely vocal performance. The MM2 comes with 3 tuning valves that supposedly render different voicings. These include bass or treble enhancement or a balanced sound signature. The marketing here is typical audiophile mumbo-jumbo. It's light on specifics and heavy on verbiage. The MM2 is an interesting package. This IEM is made of metal and see-through plastic. The face shield has angles which remind me of the B-2 stealth bomber. On the underside, it's a more traditional, somewhat boring demonstration of inner components. The face shield houses the swappable tuning valves. These are very small and you need to be careful with playing around with them. The IEM housing is fairly light and sturdy. The MM2 comes with a pleasant assortment of accessories. You get a very nice 2-pin cable. It is soft, pliable, and renders very little microphonics. Used to be that a cable of this kind would cost easily $50 by itself, and probably still does. Hidizs includes 2 additional pairs of tuning valves, one for treble and one for bass. The balanced one is already pre-installed. These come pre-attached to a metal plate with clear markings indicating which valves supposedly do what. Further, each valve set has a different color, so you can identify which one is which when they're not in their metal holder. I have to emphasize how good this holder is. Yes, it is simple, but it's thick machined aluminum. It's details like this that help promote the feeling of buying a luxury product. Speaking of which, the MM2 comes with 6 pairs of silicone ear tips. You can select between wide and narrow bore. And all of these pieces are held inside a rather plush carrying case. Hidizs says it is made of leather, and frankly, it feels like it. As for comfort, this is of course subjective, but I found the MM2 pretty easy to wear. I think that the Moondrop Starfield is simply too heavy. The Blonde BL Max is ridiculously large and heavy, and unusual in its vertical fit. The MM2, in contrast, is a much more traditional, light design. I can wear the MM2 for about 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the MM2 is built well. Its metal and plastic construction provides sufficient rigidity so that you probably don't need to worry if you drop it. The accessories are top-notch and put shame in this regard to competitors that cost 8 times as much, such as the Death on Raid Tender. I tested the MM2 using various devices. This includes the EcoZerta ITM03, Low2 PAW 6000, and RME 80i2 DAC. I used the stock accessories and installed the balanced tuning valves. I used the narrow bore ear tips. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. A few notes are worth mentioning. First, the MM2 is easy to drive. You don't need to worry about an amp. Second, I tried messing around with the various valves. I mismatched them to determine if I could tell a difference. And yes, there are differences. It's not possible for me to quantify how much bass or treble the other 2 valves help promote compared to the balanced. What I can say is that they do make a difference. Whether you will like what they do in the sound is something for you to decide. And frankly, the differences are not ginormous, but they are typically palpable. Or in other words, you can probably tell that they're there. Hidizs says that the MM2 has powerful bass. My tests indicate that the MM2 has a marginal sub-bass roll-off and a mid-bass boost. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The MM2 presented this detail, but it was a little quieter than what I heard on the more neutral Moondrop Quarks. Transients is a little bit faster on the MM2 than on the Quarks. When the crescendo hit, the MM2 made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible and was a bit louder than the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The MM2 presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the MM2 rendered them all similarly. In other words, the various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike melded with the next. The drums sounded louder on the MM2 than on the Quarks. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Nupatek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the MM2 presented the sub-bass, but the transients was faster than what I heard on the Quarks. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a medium-sized room. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I use these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the MM2 appears to have a marginal sub-bass roll-off. Mid-bass has an emphasis by a few decibels, in my estimation. Hidizs says that the vocals are lovely. I have no idea what this means. However, my tests indicate that the mids are forward and slightly sibilant. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The MM2 presented both details and emphasized the sibilance. The MM2's sibilance rendition was a few decibels brighter than what I heard on the Quarks. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The Quarks, in comparison, presented Orla's voice 1 step ahead. There was some melding among all the instruments, but no muddiness on the MM2. In Watch You Back by Haim, the MM2 again showed that it does emphasize vocal sibilance. Again, this emphasis was a bit brighter than what I heard on the Quarks. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The MM2 rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The MM2 initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The drums were the loudest instrument in the mix. The vocals remained 1 to 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the MM2 presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. All instruments melded their tonalities together slightly. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was not emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The MM2 could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The MM2 presented this detail. Overall, the MM2 seems to have forward mids with particular attention to vocals. There's a marginal emphasis of sibilance for female artists and no better than average clarity in this region. My tests indicate that the MM2 has close to neutral treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the MM2 presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher pitched notes seemed to have a very slight recession, or were less loud than what I heard on the more neutral Quarks. This difference was not significant, but somewhat noticeable in an A/B test. The timpani was audible, but did not drown out the other instruments. The MM2 has some width, but no depth or verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, but none sounded like they were deeper into the room, and no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the MM2 made the piano sound like it was 5 feet away. Its bassy notes were slightly underemphasized. The cello was as loud as the piano. Both instruments melded the tonalities together. I heard the pops, sizzles, and electric buzzing effects, creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight, though some of these details were a little bit muffled. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the MM2 rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments melded their tonalities, but none seemed veiled in the mix. The saxophone was the loudest, most obvious element in the mix. The saxophone's higher pitched notes seemed similar to what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals were struck at different positions, which should result in varied tonalities. The MM2 made each cymbal strike sound the same. Overall, the MM2 seems to have very close to neutral treble. There might be a slight upper treble reduction, but it is not significant. There's no harshness in the treble region, even at high volumes. Hidizs makes some claims about the MM2 having exceptional detail. Throughout my time with the MM2, I never felt that I was getting greater detail retrieval than what I've heard on many other IEMs, nor did the MM2 open my music to slight variances that I had not previously noticed. In fact, my experience with the MM2 was fairly average as far as detail retrieval is concerned. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cellist's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear. But subtle, nuanced details are not any clearer on the MM2 than on the far cheaper IEM like the Quarks. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The WG-T2 presents 9 to 10 footsteps. The Hidizs MS2 presents 8 to 9. The hifi T2 and T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The hifi T2 Plus, Blonde BL05, and Theaudio Lexi 2 presents 6 to 7. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Quarks, Blonde BL03, and Triple Wind Melee each present 5 to 6 footsteps. And the MM2 rendered 6 to 7 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average, and the hifi T2 would be above average. Using this standard, it seems to me that the MM2 has average detail retrieval. Of course, changing ear tips or insertion depth and your own music might render different results. My test suggests that the MM2 has average soundstage. The MM2 does not present a 3D experience. While you might hear some width, the MM2 does not excel at depth or verticality. Of course, the original recording has a lot to do with this as well. Just as with the detail resolution scale, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The hifi T2 and Hidizs MS2 have above average soundstage. The Blonde BL03 and BL05S are average at best. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are average. I think the MM2 is essentially as wide as the Moondrop Aria. The hifi T2 was noticeably wider than the MM2. The basic gist with the MM2 is that you've got 3 potential alterations to the stock tuning. Whether you use the balanced, bass, or treble valves, these make some modifications to what's already there. Fundamentally, using the balanced valves, I'd have to say that the MM2 has a, well, balanced tuning. There's a slight sub-bass roll-off, but a noticeable mid-bass boost. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is no better than average, and there is some bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward and marginally sibilant. Drums are the loudest instrument in a mix, typically. Vocals stand about 2 steps ahead of other elements. The treble seems to be close to neutral. No treble instrument sounds harsh or piercing even at high volumes. The MM2 has average detail retrieval and soundstage. Maybe this might be exciting to you, or maybe not. Perhaps you're looking for something with more soundstage, or clarity, or detail, or boomier bass, or greater treble. That is a matter of personal preference. As far as the MM2 is concerned, you've got a stock tuning that has some moderate alterations you can make to it if you so choose. It's important we do actual A-B comparisons to figure out where new products stand. Here, we will compare the MM2 against the Moondrop Aria and the 7Hz Eternal. For this test, I plugged each IEM into a passive A-B switch that was connected to my RME ADI2 DAC. I used the stock accessories. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I tried to volume match. The MM2 and Aria seem to have similar bass rendition. However, the Aria seems to have slightly greater sub-bass rendition. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass and overall clarity in this region is slightly more apparent on the MM2. Both IEMs have bass bleed into the mids, but the Aria is a bit greater. The mids are different. The Aria is recessed in comparison. Vocals stand about 1 step behind instruments on the Aria, while they are 1 to 2 steps ahead on the MM2. The Aria renders vocals a little bit closer to the ears. Clarity in this region is about the same, however. Treble, too, is different. The Aria has a mid-treble emphasis and an upper treble roll-off. The MM2 has a more neutral rendition throughout. However, neither seems harsh at high volumes. Both IEMs seem to present similar detail and soundstage. The Eternal has a closer to neutral bass presentation. The MM2, in contrast, has a mid-bass emphasis that is fairly apparent in this comparison. Clarity in this region is slightly easier to hear on the Eternal. Mid-bass impact is a bit harder on the MM2. Both IEMs have forward mids. Both push vocals ahead of instruments. Both render them with a marginal emphasis of sibilance, particularly for female artists. Clarity and separation is also similar. Treble, however, is fairly different. The Eternal has a treble roll-off, while the MM2 is closer to neutral in this regard. Clarity and separation is more obvious on the MM2. Neither IEM sounds harsh or piercing at high volumes. The Eternal has slightly above average detail and above average soundstage, compared to the MM2. The positive aspect of IEM shopping is that you'll find a multitude of physical designs and sound signatures. The negative aspect of IEM shopping is that you'll find a multitude of physical designs and sound signatures. Unless you've heard what you're interested in, it's impossible to get a concrete idea of what to buy. Here, all I can say is that all three IEMs have vastly different sound signatures. If you own one, then the other two will render your music in their own unique ways. And, of course, you might hate all of them equally. I don't want to belabor the point. The MM2 is value. There's no doubt about that in my mind. You may still dislike its sound signature or physical design, but that's a personal preference which applies to absolutely anything. There is no objective, universally appealing sound signature, irrespective of what the Harman target attempts to explain. The MM2 has good build, comfortable fit, excellent accessories, and a tunable sound. Of course, sound tuning in IEMs is not new. We've seen this in other products, both through dip switches and interchangeable valves. So the MM2 is not presenting new or unique technology in this respect. Instead, you should look at the MM2 in totality. The only way to know if you'll end up liking any IEM is to hear it yourself. While that might be a scary financial proposition for some, it's unfortunately a necessary step. Ultimately, I think that the MM2 does offer value at its price point. You may find sufficient reasons not to like it, but there's no objective one to reject it.